In 1935, a white doorman looked one of the most dangerous men in Harlem in the eye and called him boy. What happened next didn't involve fists, it didn't involve guns, and it didn't happen that night. But within weeks, one of the most famous whites-only clubs in America was forced to open its doors because Bumpy Johnson decided humiliation would be answered with strategy, not violence. This is the night a quiet walk away changed Harlem forever. Harlem, New York. Thursday evening, September 19th, 1935, around 8:15 p.m. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson walked toward the entrance of the Cotton Club, dressed in a navy blue suit that had cost him 3 months of earnings, a crisp white shirt beneath it, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like any successful businessman stepping into Harlem's most famous nightclub, but as he approached the door, he was about to learn exactly how much power a white doorman believed he had, and how quickly dignity could be challenged by a single voice standing between a man and a doorway. Harlem in the 1930s wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an economy, a culture, a reputation built by black ambition during a time when America worked hard to deny it. This was the Harlem Renaissance's afterglow, a place where music, crime, politics, and survival all collided on the same streets. Money moved through barbershops, policy banks, nightclubs, and churches. Power wasn't written into law here, it was negotiated daily. Harlem was alive, and everyone in New York knew it. White America feared it, envied it, and profited from it at the same time. But Harlem was also trapped inside segregation. Black people could create the culture, but they were rarely allowed to enjoy it on equal terms. They could play the music, cook the food, clean the floors, and pour the drinks. But when it came time to sit down as customers, to be treated as patrons instead of servants, the door was usually closed. Nowhere was that contradiction more visible or more insulting than at the Cotton Club, a nightclub planted in the heart of Harlem, powered entirely by black talent, and protected by a whites-only rule enforced at the door. White patrons traveled uptown from downtown Manhattan for the thrill. They wanted the danger without the risk, the culture without the people, the sound without the struggle. Inside, the greatest black performers in America entertained rooms full of white faces. Outside, black residents walked past knowing they were not welcome to sit at the same tables or hear the same music they helped create. That was the unspoken deal of Harlem nightlife in the 1930s. Black excellence on stage, black labor in service, white enjoyment in the audience. And as long as that system stayed unchallenged, the door stayed closed, guarded not just by a doorman, but by an entire structure built to remind black Harlem exactly where it was expected to stand. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson reached the entrance of the Cotton Club just as the night crowd was forming. Men in tailored suits, women wrapped in fur, voices low with expectation. Laughter drifted from inside, the sound of music warming up behind thick walls. This was Harlem's most famous doorway, and everyone standing there understood it marked a boundary between privilege and exclusion. Johnson stepped forward calmly, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He had walked into dangerous rooms before. This did not look like one of them. The doorman took one look at him and moved instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. He stepped directly into Johnson's path, blocking the entrance with practiced confidence. Then came the voice, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" The word landed heavy, deliberate, designed to cut deeper than any insult shouted in anger. It wasn't whispered, it was announced. A public reminder of who was allowed to pass and who was meant to stop. "This club is for white patrons only," the doorman continued. "We don't serve coloreds here except as entertainers and staff. You need to get back to Harlem where you belong." The irony hung in the air, but no one laughed. The words weren't meant to be clever. They were meant to be final. A threat followed quietly, almost casually. Move along, or the police get involved. That was how authority spoke in 1935. Johnson stopped walking. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anything. He simply stood there and looked at the man in front of him, not with rage but with attention, as if he were studying a detail that would matter later. Around them, the sidewalk grew silent. White patrons watched closely, curious to see whether this well-dressed black man would forget his place or accept it. Some faces showed amusement, others discomfort, but none stepped in. Silence always sided with power. In that moment, Johnson understood something clearly. The insult wasn't personal. The doorman didn't know who he was. didn't recognize the most powerful black criminal in Harlem standing inches away. This wasn't about Bumpy Johnson, the man. It was about Bumpy Johnson, the color, about a system that assumed any black man, no matter how successful, no matter how respected in his own world, could be reduced to a boy with a single word at a doorway. Johnson felt the eyes on his back. He could sense the expectation, that familiar pressure to either explode or disappear. Both outcomes would entertain the crowd. Both would end the same way. Police, blood, or humiliation turned into a story white people told later. He understood the trap perfectly, and instead of stepping into it, he chose something else. He smiled. Not warm, not friendly, a controlled, measured expression that said nothing and promised nothing. For 3 seconds, he held the doorman's gaze, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for confidence to flicker. Then Johnson nodded once, turned away, and walked back down the street. His pace steady, his shoulders straight. To anyone watching, it looked like acceptance, like defeat. But beneath that quiet walk away, Harlem had just shifted, because the insult had been delivered, and Bumpy Johnson had decided it would not be forgotten. Arguing that night would have given the doorman exactly what the system expected: a raised voice, a public scene, a reason to summon the police and let uniforms finish what words had started. In 1935, a black man arguing with a white doorman outside a whites-only club didn't end with justice. It ended with handcuffs, batons, or worse. Bumpy Johnson knew that. He had seen it happen too many times to men who thought dignity could be defended with volume. If Johnson had protested, he would have been transformed instantly from a well-dressed businessman into a problem. The crowd would have shifted from curious to hostile. Police would have arrived not to ask questions, but to restore order. And order in that world meant removing the black man who dared to challenge a white man's authority. The insult would have become entertainment. Another story about an uppity black man who forgot his place and was put back where he belonged. There was also the deeper humiliation. Arguing at the door would have meant begging for entry into a space designed to reject him. It would have framed the Cotton Club as the prize and the doorman as the judge. Johnson understood that power doesn't live in raised voices or clever words shouted on a sidewalk. It lives in leverage, and at that door he had none. Not legal leverage, not public sympathy, not physical advantage that wouldn't trigger deadly consequences. Most men react in the moment. Ego demands an answer. Pride demands resistance. But Johnson had learned something the hard way. Survival and real power required patience. It required knowing when a fight was unwinnable and when it could be moved somewhere else. That night wasn't about winning an argument. It was about choosing the battlefield. By walking away, Johnson denied the system its spectacle. No arrest, no beating, no story to laugh about later. Just silence. And silence unsettles people who believe they've already won. The doorman expected anger or submission. What he got instead was neither, and that was dangerous, because it meant the insult had not been resolved. It had been stored. Johnson understood the power dynamics clearly. At the Cotton Club's door, the doorman held authority backed by police, badges, and unspoken rules. But Harlem itself was a different world, a world Johnson knew intimately, a world where money, muscle, loyalty, and organization mattered more than uniforms. By walking away that night, Johnson wasn't retreating, he was repositioning, and when he chose to respond, it would be on ground where the rules favored him. Johnson walked without urgency, his footsteps steady against Harlem pavement. He wasn't running from the insult, he was carrying it with him. Streetlights passed overhead, storefronts glowed softly, voices floated out of bars and apartments. This was his world, the one that knew his name, the one that moved according to rules very different from the ones enforced at the Cotton Club's door. With every block he walked, the anger cooled, and something sharper took its place. Clarity. Without planning to, Johnson found himself stopping outside the Savoy ballroom. Music spilled into the street, laughter followed it, people dressed well and proud moved freely through the entrance. Black men and women entering as customers, not servants. No one checking their skin before checking their tickets. No one reminding them where they belonged. This was what ownership looked like. This was what dignity sounded like. Standing there, Johnson saw the contrast clearly. Inside the Cotton Club, black talent performed for white pleasure under white control. Outside the Savoy, black people owned the building, controlled the money, decided who came in and how they were treated. Both places existed in the same neighborhood. Both made money from entertainment. but only one respected the people who created the culture. And that's when the realization hit him fully. Harlem created the culture, but someone else owned the door. White businessmen had planted themselves in the heart of Black Harlem, used black musicians, black workers, and black reputation to attract white money, and then shut black people out of the audience entirely. The Cotton Club didn't just exclude black patrons, it extracted value from Harlem and sent the profits somewhere else. That arrangement only survived because it was tolerated, because people believed there was no alternative, because black workers needed jobs, black musicians needed stages, and black leaders lacked the economic force to challenge white ownership directly. The door stayed closed not because it was right, but because it was protected. Protected by money, connections, and the assumption that Harlem would accept whatever arrangement it was given. Johnson understood then that the insult at the door wasn't an isolated moment, it was a symptom, a signal pointing toward a deeper imbalance, and unlike arguments shouted on sidewalks, this imbalance could be attacked, not with fists, not with guns, but with pressure, with organization, with the kind of economic force that made doors open whether the people behind them wanted to or not. As Johnson stood outside the Savoy watching Harlem enjoy something it truly owned, he wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. He was thinking about structure and how to break it. Johnson didn't rush the next move. Power rushed decisions failed fast, and he wasn't interested in noise. He was interested in results. By the time he reached a payphone near Lenox Avenue, the insult had transformed into purpose. This wasn't revenge, this was coalition. And coalitions required the right voices, the right leverage, and the right timing. The first call went to a woman who understood power better than most men in Harlem, Stephanie St. Clair. She had built an empire in a city that tried to erase her at every turn. She controlled policy banks, commanded loyalty, and knew how to apply pressure without ever appearing in the spotlight. When Johnson explained what had happened at the Cotton Club, there was no shock in her response, only recognition. She had seen the same doors close in her face. She understood exactly what kind of insult had been delivered and what kind of answer it deserved. The second call crossed a different line of power, not criminal but moral. Not underground, but public. Adam Clayton Powell Sr., a man who spoke to thousands every Sunday, a man who had fought discrimination with sermons, organizing, and appeals to conscience for decades. Powell had influence Johnson didn't, and Johnson had leverage Powell never possessed. When those two worlds aligned, something unusual became possible. Johnson didn't waste words. He didn't exaggerate. He described the insult, the location, the policy, and the larger contradiction. A whites-only club sitting in the heart of Harlem, feeding on black talent while excluding black people. Powell understood immediately that this was bigger than one man being turned away. It was a public symbol of everything Harlem had been forced to tolerate. And for the first time, there was a chance to do more than preach about it. By midnight, Johnson had begun assembling people quietly, not crowds, not headlines, just the right individuals, policy operators, labor organizers, ministers, professionals who had money, respectability, and their own memories of humiliation. Each person brought a different form of power to the table: money, workers, moral authority, community reach. This wasn't a mob, and it wasn't a riot. It was a design, a recognition that no single group could challenge the Cotton Club alone, but together they could surround it, squeeze it, make discrimination expensive. As Johnson moved from call to call, one thing became clear. The insult at the door had unlocked something larger than anger. It had created alignment. And once power aligns, it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to apply pressure. By midnight, about 15 people gathered in the back room of a small speakeasy on 133rd Street. The door stayed locked, the music out front stayed loud, and nothing about the place suggested history was being shaped inside. Men and women sat close together around a scarred wooden table. Policy operators, union contacts, church leaders, doctors and lawyers who carried respectability instead of fear, but who had felt the same quiet humiliations. They weren't there out of curiosity. They were there because when Bumpy Johnson called, this particular combination of people knew it meant something serious. Johnson stood at the head of the table and spoke calmly. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures. He described the Cotton Club, the Doorman, the Word Boy, and the command to go back to Harlem. As he talked, faces around the table tightened, not shocked, recognizing each person had their own version of that doorway, their own moment of being reminded where they were allowed to exist. When Johnson finished, he let the silence work. Then he said it plainly. The Cotton Club turned me away because I'm colored. He didn't rush what came next. That club sits in Harlem. It uses our musicians, our workers, our reputation. It makes its money because it is surrounded by us, and yet it refuses to let us sit inside and enjoy what we create. Heads nodded slowly. This wasn't new information. It was just rarely spoken this directly in a room with leverage. Then Johnson delivered the line that changed the tone completely. We're not burning it down. We're making it impossible to run. What followed wasn't chaos, it was structure. Labor pressure came first. Every black employee inside the Cotton Club was a pressure point. Musicians could demand better pay and conditions. Waiters and kitchen staff could slow service without breaking rules. Not sabotage, just inefficiency. Enough to frustrate white patrons and increase costs without giving management a clear reason to fire anyone. Next came supplier leverage. Food, liquor, linens, deliveries. Every business the Cotton Club depended on also depended on Harlem. Suppliers would be encouraged to choose where their loyalty lay, lose one customer or lose the neighborhood. Most would choose survival. Disruptions wouldn't shut the club down, but they would bleed it slowly. Then came community pressure. Sermons would be preached, meetings held. The Cotton Club's racism would be named publicly, not whispered, but spoken aloud. The goal wasn't to shame white patrons into staying away. It was to strip the club of the comfort that came from silence. Finally, bureaucratic pressure, health inspections, fire codes, licensing questions. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just attention. The kind of attention that costs money, time, and patience. When the meeting ended, there were no cheers, no speeches about justice, just understanding. This wasn't emotion anymore. It was machinery, and once set in motion, it wouldn't stop until the door opened. The campaign didn't announce itself. There were no protests outside the Cotton Club, no threats slipped under doors, no public enemies named. Everything happened quietly, professionally, almost politely. That calm was intentional, because panic brings attention, and attention brings police. What the Cotton Club faced instead was something harder to fight. Normal operations slowly becoming abnormal. It began with the music. Duke Ellington walked into management's office and spoke without anger. He asked for more money, better treatment, basic respect. When they pointed to contracts, he pointed to options, other venues, other offers, places willing to pay more and treat his band like assets instead of decorations. Ellington didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply made it clear that the Cotton Club needed him more than he needed them. And for the first time, the club felt that imbalance shift. At the same time, service inside the club began to change, not dramatically, not enough to justify firings, just enough to be noticed. Orders took longer. Drinks arrived late. Plates cooled before they hit tables. Mistakes appeared that hadn't before. Nothing malicious, just careful, too careful. White patrons who were used to flawless attention started glancing at watches and complaining quietly. Management blamed staff. Staff nodded politely and kept moving at the same pace. Behind the scenes, costs crept upward. Suppliers missed deliveries, then charged premiums to make things right. Liquor arrived late. Fresh food had to be sourced elsewhere. Linens needed replacing sooner than expected. Each problem was manageable on its own. Together, they drained money and patience. The Cotton Club was still open, but it was bleeding efficiency. Then came the inspections. A health official noticed issues in the kitchen. A fire inspector flagged exit concerns. Licensing questions appeared at the worst possible times. None of it shut the club down. That wasn't the goal. The goal was uncertainty, meetings, paperwork, expenses that couldn't be planned for. Management spent their days reacting instead of controlling. What made it terrifying was the lack of a clear enemy. There was no one to punch, no single person to threaten, no switch to flip to make it stop. Every lever that kept the Cotton Club running was being touched at once. Labor, supplies, talent, regulation, and the calm never broke. No demands shouted, no ultimatums issued, just a steady message delivered through balance sheets and schedules. By the second week, management knew something was wrong. By the third, they knew it was organized. Profits shrank. Complaints increased. Ellington's leverage grew stronger with every night he stayed. And somewhere between rising costs and slipping control, the cotton club's owners began to understand the real danger. Not violence, not riots, but a neighborhood that had decided it was done being extracted from. And once that decision was made, the door was no longer just a door. It was a liability. The pressure finally reached the man who owned the cotton club. Oni Madden had built his reputation on violence and intimidation, had survived prohibition, had buried enemies who thought he could be pushed. But Harlem was not his territory. It was his investment. And power works differently when you're not in your territory. Madden could command fear downtown, but uptown he depended on systems he didn't control and people who no longer cooperated. That distinction mattered now. Madden knew the problems weren't accidents. He felt it in the timing, in the coordination, in the way every solution created two new complications. When he asked around quietly, one name surfaced again and again. Bumpy Johnson. Not shouted, not advertised, just acknowledged. Madden understood what that meant. This wasn't a street fight, this was leverage. And leverage doesn't respond to threats the way fear does. He sent word through intermediaries, expecting pushback, expecting demands he could negotiate down. Instead, he was invited to a meeting with an attorney who spoke calmly and precisely. No insults, no raised voices, just facts laid out cleanly. The Cotton Club's difficulties were the result of its policies. Those difficulties would continue, and they would grow, until the policy changed. Madden exploded at first. Threats came easily to him. He talked about connections, about men who could make problems disappear overnight. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Violence here would cost more than it solved. It would ignite a war in a neighborhood that didn't belong to him. And worse, it wouldn't end the pressure. Because this campaign wasn't held together by one man. It was held together by alignment. When the anger burned off, calculation took its place. Madden asked what was required. Not what would make them happy, but what would make it stop. The answer was simple and devastating. Open the doors. End the policy. Allow black patrons to enter without interference, no spectacle, no apology, just compliance. Madden negotiated language, details, conditions, trying to preserve as much control as possible while conceding the point that mattered, because for the first time, he understood something clearly. In Harlem, he could own a building, he could own a club, but he did not own the ground beneath it. And when a neighborhood decides it will no longer support extraction without respect, the smartest gangster learns when to yield. On October 15, 1935, the Cotton Club issued a statement that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The policy had changed. Patrons would no longer be turned away because of color. There was no celebration in the announcement, no apology, no explanation, just words on paper. And Harlem waited. 3 nights later, the test came. Well-dressed black professionals arrived at the Cotton Club, doctors, lawyers, teachers, men and women who carried themselves with quiet confidence. They approached the same door that had rejected so many before. This time, the doorman stepped aside. No argument, no delay. They were seated inside the club, served with the same attention as white patrons, and listened to the music from the audience instead of the sidewalk. For the first time, the door held no power over them. Word moved fast through Harlem, not in headlines, but in conversations, in barbershops, in churches, in back rooms. If the Cotton Club could be forced to open, then no door was permanent, no policy untouchable. The aftershock rippled outward. Other establishments paid attention. Some integrated quietly to avoid pressure. Others waited and watched, hoping the moment would pass. It didn't. What changed wasn't just who sat inside a nightclub. It was the understanding of leverage. Economic pressure had done what moral arguments and legal appeals had failed to do. A precedent had been set. Discrimination could be made costly. And once that lesson was learned, Harlem was no longer just a place where culture was created. It was a place where rules could be rewritten. That doorman never knew what he started. He went home that night believing he had done his job, believing the door had held, because it always had. He never saw the meetings, the phone calls, the calculations, the pressure applied quietly from every direction. He never understood that a single word spoken with confidence could awaken something larger than anger. But Harlem did. Harlem recognized what had happened because it had lived it for generations. The insult wasn't new, but the response was no riot, no fire, no blood in the street, just organization, patience, and pressure applied until power shifted. What began as one man being turned away became a lesson written into the neighborhood itself.